Report for today. It is Friday, May 2nd, 2014. I'm Doug Hagmann, co-host along with my son, fellow investigator, fellow researcher, Joe Hagmann. Together you are about to hear 3 hours of incredible radio programming tonight. I'm just so excited for tonight, folks. We have a very special show for you planned. Before we get into the details, I do want to let everyone know that portions of this broadcast tonight are made possible and are sponsored by Nature Box. There, order great tasting, healthy snacks right to your door. Forget the vending machine and get in shape for the summer with healthy, and I mean healthy, delicious, and I do mean delicious, treats like the Everything Bagel Sticks. Support this show and get 50% off your first order. Go to naturebox.com/CFP-radio. See, that's our secret code, naturebox.com/CFP-radio. That's naturebox.com/CFP-radio. Folks, you're listening to the only show where the news is presented to you in 3D. We look well beyond the headlines, the bylines, the misinformation and disinformation to bring you the news behind the news. New listeners, every night, 8 to 11 p.m. Eastern Time. That's when we broadcast. Folks, you can find us on the Internet. Our home base, HomelandSecurityUS.com. Please check that often now. Coming alive, putting up a lot of new content, a lot of original content, and got some surprises in store for readers there as well. Folks, we're also simulcast by the Christians United Broadcasting Network. There you can tune us in at the Hagmann and Hagmann Report.com. As I say all the time, you got to spell out the word and in two N's on Hagmann. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for your belief and your trust in us as we walk through this minefield of current events together. Just want to say that in preparation for the show, before I bring Joe on, preparation for the show, I happened upon this quote, folks, and please listen to this carefully because this is going to set the tone, I believe, for tonight. And the quote is this: in order to properly understand the big picture, everyone should fear becoming mentally clouded and obsessed with one small section of truth. And for some reason, that quote resonated with me and stuck with me, and I want to be sure I said that at the top of the show. But at any rate, with that, I'm looking at Joe working some controls over there, doing something. Okay, Joe,
all
welcome.
Right, here we go. Very glad to be here. We got a great show for you guys tonight. We have our guest on the line, our guest who has been a previous guest, kind of impromptu. The times he's been on. This time we scheduled him.
First scheduled appearance, Joe. First scheduled appearance. This guy is the real James Bond. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I did anyway. So we do this all the time, don't we? We kind of scrap for.
With that, we have W on. So I'll let
there we go.
You bring him on.
All right. Well, W. Of course, our goal is to completely dominate the entire alphabet with initials. So we've already have V. Now we have W. Perhaps we can get the others in due time. But for those who don't know you, you have lived your life in the recesses, the shadows of, well, we'll just say places like the old Watergate parking garage, or the parking garage that was made famous by Watergate. But even more than that, you've been involved in a number of things, including but not limited to actively, dare I say, taking down the Soviet Union, among other things. I'm not going to get into everything that you've done, obviously, but suffice it to say that you're the real James Bond in my book, and someone of a man of integrity, character, and a guy that I would trust my life with, and a guy that, frankly, is a real man's man, despite the fact that he orders some interesting coffee drinks, but. But come on board.
I was racing to get to Starbucks to get me a coffee drink to keep me going through the show, and I got 2 blocks from the Starbucks at the world headquarters. That'll help some of your listeners know where I'm at today. And a train showed up. If I had stepped on the gas in my hot rod, I could have easily made it through with all 530 horsepower, but I decided to be mundane and sedate and relax. I figured it's just going to be a train. That train took 10 minutes. It was the longest train. It probably had 200 cars on it, and of course it was going slow because it's in the city. And I almost didn't have enough time to go to Starbucks to get my coffee before we started the interview. And so now, fortunately, I'll probably be awake through the interview. Otherwise, I might have been dragging a little bit. But
well, I got to tell you, folks, the Starbucks is a requirement for this man. So, if we had some sort of Dropbox address for you, we could send everyone could send you Starbucks cards for your time. But that's okay.
I told one of my business partners that the first commercial outlet in our space station when we get it in position here shortly is going to be a Starbucks bar, and I want to have the highest altitude Starbucks off planet.
And folks, he's not kidding, by the way. Just as an aside, he's not kidding. But well, W, I'll tell you what. Here's how we're going to do it. If this is all right with you, we and we've talked about this, folks. We've had a litany of guests. Roster of guests on over the last several months, even the last year and a half. They've all brought dots and pieces of the puzzle to the table. They all have brought information. Some of it seemingly disparate from what we talk about. Others, of course, are right in line with what we talk about. It's your job as a professor, if you will, teaching a class, is to kind of give us a test for the midterm exam we're about to face. So we're going to just turn it over to you and just take us where you want to take us, and then we'll jump in as we need to.
Well, and if you have questions, probably listeners do too, and I can probably find my way back to where I was trying to say. So if something stands out to you that you're not getting or understanding, you don't have to be shy. A couple of things. Number one, just in case I mentioned something that you want to go back and maybe go down one of the rabbit trails, if you have pen or paper around, you might want to note a term or something like that. The other thing is that if you're listening to this out as a recording later, I'd ask you to go back and read Life as an Investigator is Like a Box of Chocolates. I'm not going to talk about that right off the bat, but down the road during the course of this, I hope to come back to some of the issues that were raised there.
On our show promo, and I'll just say this for the folks who are listening, are both live and in the archive. On our show promo, Connecting the Dots, under show prep, it says, please read this. When you click on this, it'll take you directly to that article.
Good.
Please.
We had some email questions about where to find that.
Yeah. And show prep, please read this under Connecting the Dots for today. The W's picture is right there on the left. You can, I got your picture up, W. So.
Yeah, did you have my Indian feathers and tribal outfit on there too? Is that the one with all of the?
No, you're just in the shadows. You're nothing but a silhouette, my friend.
All right. Well, let me just also say this too, for any of those folks that think that we're going to give away the GPS coordinates of the farmhouses that aren't actually farmhouses tonight, and or the launch codes and the names of deep cover agents or something like that. This isn't that program. Tonight, I want to talk more theory, history, the physics. Try to get in the mind where some of the folks are coming from, how they got there, that are running the planet right now, and why they think what they do, where it makes sense, where there's actually some pretty good logic that got them there potentially, and then for others of our listeners, I think it's a very important detail. We have a lot of Christians. Your show is aimed at Christians, and so my presentation is really aimed at them tonight in a large measure. For non-believers, agnostics, you might get a very good clue of why even your beliefs are maybe well-founded in some ways. So I'm not just talking to Christians, but what I'm concerned about is a lot of times we hear trigger words by guests. You know, for example, let's just use Richard Hoagland last week, and I think some people were upset by some of what he said or heard key trigger words like astrology, and they were like, "Oh, that's evil," and they're instantly tune him out. He's from the devil. He's not talking about anything I want to hear about, and they can't take a deep breath and try to understand, even if you disagree, what underlying principles, information he might have been trying to convey there, and then how it feeds into and is relevant to us. Because remember, it's not what you believe, it's what they believe who are running the planet right now that is really affecting how we live. Because at this exact moment, the people that have the controls outside of the control room where Joe fortunately has the controls, they're, a different group. And so we're trying to understand what's driving them, what's, directing them, what are the principles, what are the ideas that cause them to think, function, do what they do. And what is the mindset or even the mind behind them that has gotten them and us here today, right now, where we are, with all these events churning around us in the world and these burning questions arising and propelling us ahead, seemingly to this new world order, just ahead, just around the corner. What's the driver? So with
what's
that
their
in
belief?
mind,
Yeah.
What do they believe? What's driving them? How do we get there? But we're going to take a lot of wild twists and turns, and I hope I can pull it all together and make it make sense. So I appreciate that everybody showed up, and let's tear into it first.
Let's rock and roll. Buckle up. I'm sorry. And folks, I do urge everyone, seriously, I do urge you, unless you're driving, of course, at this point or something, take some notes. That'll save you some time, because you will refer to them later. I've got, and I've told our guests this, I have actually, those police notebooks that the detectives carry, the police issued notebooks. I get them by the case, and I have 14 of them filled up right now, just from your notes, our conversations from your notes. So it's going to be a very informative program. So, folks, please grab a pen and paper and take notes. Go ahead, sir.
All right. When the pharaohs were entombed, when they'd passed away, and the wealthy people of Egypt, we now know, we go back and we look at these sarcophaguses and the burial chambers, etc., and we know that the whole death process was a very elaborate process. They went to extreme measures to mummify these individuals of prominence, these people that they felt were godlike or, in fact, gods or God. And we look at it now with a modern mind, and we think, well, they're just nuts, crazy, And they were gods. I mean, how the height of arrogance. But we have to think about it a little bit more. What were they really trying to do when they preserved their body in this way? And not just themselves, but then they had elaborate systems where they buried sailboats, fully, complete sailboats all dismantled and carefully packed away and stored underground for them. And we've gone back and discovered these items. Oftentimes they were buried with their wives and servants, and they were also preserved with the understanding, with the belief that one day they were going to be resurrected and would live again physically. And we look at it and we think with our modern minds that they're a little touched. They didn't understand the nature of the world. As Christians, they didn't understand salvation. Christ hadn't arrived yet. They believed in, voodoo. But then there's another interesting thing. Let's walk away from that for a moment and go somewhere else. The Smithsonian received the bones of giants. And there have been numerous accounts over the last century and a half of people, individuals, groups who turned over these bones and artifacts from burial chambers and burial sites that were from giants. And Smithsonian, you go back and you ask them, hey, what happened with those bones? We destroyed them. Yeah, they're gone. They're history. Don't have them. Don't know what you're talking about. Who are you? Well, no, we know you got them. You don't know nothing. Places all over the world, there's been this allegation out there for some time that some hidden hand group has been systematically gathering up all of these old bones, collecting them. Why? And why not admit it? What's this all about? But let's step aside from that for a minute, and let's look at another situation. What is consciousness? Where are you? Think about it right now. We hear near-death experiences by people all the time who have passed over out of their body, and they give very credible explanations of how they rose out of their body, had a physical form. They saw things in an operating room, for example, that you could not have seen from where they were lying physically in their body. Conversations, words that happened in a hallway just outside the door that you had to be there to hear it. And people say that they heard this word or that conversation or saw this person dressed a certain way, and they were in the operating room on the table. And very difficult to deny that they had an experience that wasn't just an experience inside of the tissue of their gray matter, their brain, that they had somehow been transported or allowed to move about outside of their physical corpse. So then we ask ourselves, where are we? Where's our consciousness? Are you right now actually in your physical body? Or is it possible, is it conceivable that your conscious is somewhere maybe within the parameters of your physical body and more, but not technically really inside your physical body? I have remote control devices, including one of our aircraft that we're working on that's remote control. And it is capable of traveling very fast, very far. And yet, some of its operations are pre-programmed, and it operates autonomously on its own. within its own computer program inside its computers. But then there's other overriding information that comes remotely that is broadcast to the aircraft, and it gives information, and there's more broadcast to it. And so the real mind behind the operation of that aircraft could be at a great distance from the aircraft. Technically, it could be, to, the moon or to outer planets. Distant. And yet still be operated remotely. The real mind isn't in the aircraft, although it's physically expressing itself through that aircraft. So where's that consciousness? The world around us, and we say, no, the body, the consciousness, the physical, we're right here. I'm right here. But let's diverge again for just a moment. Years ago, before cloning was actually really known outside of a very tiny realm of people, there was a particular location where we were examining cloning issues. And there was a dog that had been a pet. And that dog had been well known and would greet aircraft as they arrived and departed, and the crews knew him. And he was very well-liked, had a very unique personality, did some tricks, and it was just great. When he passed away, he was buried in this very arid, semi-desert environment. So years later, at a certain point, somebody had the idea that it'd be interesting to see if we could clone Lee. And so he was exhumed, and some DNA was extracted from different areas of the corpse, in bone areas and in teeth areas, because those areas hold DNA, preserve it longer than most of the other areas. And there were some other samples taken, but those were really key. And then the animal was cloned. And in one of the clones that was done, that there was health issues with some of them early on, and it took a little time to get things right. In one of those done, it was noticed that the dog operated mannerism-wise, and even to some tricks that it did as it was maturing, as though it already knew these tricks that were really, unique to its ancestor. And the question was, did that animal have that information in its DNA? Was that knowledge of how to do the tricks something that was recorded somehow in the DNA? Had the DNA been overwritten during the course of the dog's life to be able to know a trick, and it somehow is recorded there like information, like writing a movie onto a DVD or something and recording it on the DVD? Had it somehow been recorded on the DNA? Conversely, the question was there something in the DNA that predisposed the dog to want to behave or operate or do things really just like the other dog, even to the paths it wanted to go down and this daily routine that the ancestor had? And none of those seemed to make sense, because the behaviors that we were looking at, that we're talking about, are learned behaviors. They did not seem to be things that you would have had within its DNA as how the animal was built at a structural level. This was more information related things that would have been recorded in the mind, that would have been recorded in, ways that it's like the difference between, with the old reel-to-reel tapes, you have the tape itself that can hold information, but then you have to write information on it. And when you play it back, you get the information you wrote on it. You don't get new tape suddenly coming out of the tape machine because you're not manufacturing tape. You're just downloading the information that was recorded on it, writing it on, taking it off. So the question was, how could this dog have known these tricks? How could it want to follow these same paths when it hadn't been taught this stuff? It had not been shown it, really, to that point in time. But because of some health issues that were raised, the dog had started to get sick. And this was early on, and people really, they're monitoring it very closely. These are scientists having some fun while they're doing other real research. But this was a question that came up, trying to think it through. And they had taught the dog a couple of very specific tricks during this time that the previous dog wouldn't have known, because the facilities are newer and had some new stuff and different people. So that animal died. And they had decided to clone that animal. So now we have a clone of a clone. Plus we had still some work going on with the previous clone. And the interesting thing was to try and determine if there was some recorded information in the clone of the clone that was transmitted from one to the other. Now, the background for that was there was also simultaneous work being done where they had taken earthworms. Another group, but certainly we were aware of it. And this other group had taken these earthworms, and they had taught them that when there was certain stimuli, electrical stimuli within a box of materials, that if they went a certain direction, there would be food. And so they essentially literally trained these earthworms, which you would think they have very little, gray matter, brain, whatever, to do anything. But in their opinion, they had trained these earthworms to respond in a certain way to certain types of stimuli. Then they ground up these earthworms and fed them to other earthworms. And they noticed that without learning the behavior, the other earthworms began to operate in the same way. That something in the material that was transferred from one to the other, actually that information somehow went to the next set of earthworms, and they were able to essentially be trained just by exposure to the material, the biomaterial of these other earthworms, the DNA, if you will, cat inside their system. So these were really, wild questions. I mean, this is, strange stuff, and believe me, we'll get to the politics in a little while. We'll get to today in the world around us in a little while. But let's think about this question. Now this dog, who's a clone of a clone, and another dog that's just another clone of the original, are being raised isolated from each other. And an interesting thing is learned. The clone of a clone, as well as the original, both show some knowledge, some predisposition, some acknowledgement of how to do a trick that had only been learned by that first clone. So how could a clone of the original dog and a clone of the clone both know this new same trick when there was no physical contact between them, there was no learned information between them, not being raised around that dog at the middle?
And most importantly, it could only be by the environmentally introduced behavioral training, if you will.
Yes, this is a learned behavior, a learned trick. So that got me thinking and asking the question, well, what's the nature of consciousness? This is a very long time ago. I mean, this is a long time ago. And coming at it from a spiritual side, I said, well, but the consciousness isn't inside the body. It's coming from a remote location. Now, to most physicists, they're just looking at a brain and saying, nope, it's right there. It's the cells right there. There's a gray matter. We know this part of the brain transmits neurons this way, and it registers information here, and this is how it works. And they're looking totally inside the brain. They're looking inside the DNA as little recorders to see how it could be registered on the DNA and be written on the DNA. And I'm going, yeah, but the original, how could it possibly know it? So then, we look at twins here in the world, and of course back even to World War II with Mengele and things like that, looking at, twins. How could twins know something happened to their genetically same person at a distance, even though they had no contact? We have lots of stories of twins where they seem to know when their twin is in trouble or hurt or what they're thinking and know the thought even before they do it. Well, is it because of close contact while they're being raised? But in some cases, twins were separated at birth or shortly thereafter, and yet they know that they have a twin somewhere. They think thoughts with the other twin. They live lives that are somehow similar. And if we aren't talking twins, let's just go to the mother-child relationship, where there's a lot of shared DNA. And mothers oftentimes, and even children, but usually it's the mother to the children direction, know that something has happened, something's going on with their child, even though they have no physical way to know that. And so how could that possibly be? When we look at the world, one of the important considerations, and for example, I have a relative who, he and his wife are professors with their own wing of a university that they're in charge of. So when I'm raising this stuff, their eyes glaze over, and you can see the smoke starting to come out from underneath their scalps and ears because they just don't even want to, they want to be able to track an electron. They want to be able to see an electromagnetic disturbance. They want to see photons going from here to there. And so when I talk about some kind of a conscious interaction, action thing, they think I'm talking religion and spirituality and voodoo, and they don't want to hear this stuff. They don't want to hear it because they can't measure it, see it, touch it, feel it. They can't get it on a gauge, and it's heresy. It really just cooks them. Well, where's the electromagnetic connection? Where's the photonic connection? It'll short wire, right? I mean, they get very upset. And if you try to talk religion or spirituality, well, that's not something that they can't quantify it. So they don't want to hear it. They don't want it introduced in a university setting. They don't want to research or touch it because that's heresy. To a university professor, that's the same as to a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters here, same as saying astrology, astrology, astrology. And the cross comes out, they start making signs, and they're all stressed out. But I'm trying to come at this and look at it and go, is there a real physics that even if it isn't understood, is there a real physics, an underlying testable, measurable, tangible physics here that we have to know, understand, grasp? And like you and I have talked before, Doug, on many occasions, sometimes you have to think bigger, oftentimes, and sometimes you have to think smaller. Now, I'm going to bring all of these things together before we're done, but I hope your audience is staying with us. I know some people, their brains are already getting, a little overheated, but stick with us. I think we can pull it together. So now we look at matter. And as you know, I've been working on a paper for a little bit here. I just haven't had time to get back to it. But what's the matter with matter? What's the nature of matter? What are we talking about here? You see, the matter world that we live in, everything we know about the world we live in, we know using 3 measuring devices, tools, instruments. And those 3 measuring devices that are in our toolbox that all physicists use are the limitations of our ability to understand the matter world around us. It's the limitation of these professors. And what are those 3 things? Electricity, magnetism, and the light, photons. You see, everything we try to measure in the world around us, we measure looking for an electrical positive, negative charge. Everything, even with these super colliders, we're looking for an electrical disturbance, an electrical discharge. When we look at magnetism, an attraction, a repulsion, a gauge strength, how strong is the magnetic signal? And then photonically, is light emitted? Did the light go somewhere? Is it absorbed? What happened to the photon? And so whenever I want to look at something to see how big it is, how fast it's moving, what its charge state is, how strong it is, I have to use one of those 3 tools out of the toolbox that are in the matter world. Now, you can take the biggest crescent wrench or pipe wrench, and you say, well, there's no electricity or magnetism in a pipe wrench. I just turn a bolt with it. Well, no, actually, there's all of those things in there. When you put the pipe wrench on there, you're using electrical energy and magnetic energy, using it through your bones and tissue and hands, and there's a certain resistance that's allowed for and the way all those things work. At the end of the day, you're using forms of electricity and magnetism, and then you're seeing how far the bolt went, not just by touch and feel, but because you see light reflecting off that surface, photonic observations. And so anything that you can describe that you do in the physical world in which we humans live can be reduced down to electricity, light, or magnetism. And an interesting thing about that is I can take electricity and I can make a magnet. In fact, the big electromagnets that are used in these junkyards picking up a whole car, and you see that thing, they use electricity in a coil and create a magnet. Because at a right angle to the flow of the electricity, you get a magnetic signal. I can take a magnet and I can convert magnetic energy into electricity. So electricity and magnetism are interchangeable. When I take an electric motor and I spin it around with electricity, I can see a magnetic field adjacent to the rotation of that motor. The one and the other exist together. And can take light and convert it to electricity and magnetism. Why? We have solar collectors. solar collectors turn photonic energy, light packets, into electricity or magnetism. So electricity, magnetism, and photonic light activity are interchangeable. And in fact, like a prism, you might just very well really be looking at three sides of exactly the same substance, material, energy. It's another way of saying that all you're really seeing is three different expressions of the very same thing. So light, electricity, and magnetism are interchangeable. They're one thing. And that's the matter world that we live in, is something that's this amalgamation of these three energies. Now, one other thing. We say, what is matter? So this is this matter world. These are these measuring devices that we have. Okay, so what's the smallest piece of matter that we can measure, turn, twist, manipulate, observe? And classic explanation is the Planck length. The Planck length is the smallest thing that theoretically we would be able to observe or measure or manipulate in this matter realm that we exist in. Well, what is the Planck length? Theoretically, it's 2 widths of an electron, because at the time it was believed that the smallest piece of matter, the smallest piece of something that we could find, would be an electron. Very, 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 very tiny. And if an electron was standing absolutely motionless still, then we wouldn't see it, because if there was light coming from the other side, it'd be kind of, blocked. We wouldn't even know there was light there. And if it wasn't bumping one way or the other, we wouldn't see an electrical disturbance, and we wouldn't see it pushing other pieces of matter to one side or the other, electrons or otherwise, and we wouldn't see a magnetic disturbance, because it's just frozen, it's sitting still. But the instant that an electron moved just 1 electron width, just picture a little kid's ball, and when the ball is black and you're in a black room or something and there's nothing there, but if you just move it just that little bit, in theory you might measure a disturbance in the electrical field, which you might think was air in the room or something. You might feel a magnetic disturbance, an attraction or repulsion or other stuff, because it kind of stirs the pot a little bit. So this electron moving just 1 electron width would be the smallest size of something, matter, that we could possibly measure using the tools available to us, which are light, electricity, and magnetism. So 2 widths of an electron is the Planck length. And that's the smallest thing that we could observe, manipulate, control in the world that we live in. But is that the smallest thing that exists? Just because it's the smallest that we can see and measure and manipulate with the tools available to us, does that mean that's the smallest that it is? If it's not, if there's stuff smaller than that, how would you know it was there? And if you can't measure it, see it, manipulate it with these big clumsy tools that we have, does that mean it's not there? Does that mean it doesn't exist? No. Sometimes we talk about people limiting God because they can't imagine something more than a certain thing. Does that mean God's limited by your cranial capacity? Does that mean that God's limited because you can't think any bigger? No, it just means that it's outside the realm of your understanding, knowledge, experience, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist doesn't mean God can't do it, doesn't operate a certain way. It just means that you don't get it, the memo yet. So it's possible that there's stuff smaller all around us right now than the matter that we see, touch, feel, manipulate instantly. And yet it's right there. You can't see it. You can't measure it, but it's right there. It's possible, isn't it? Now, let's stop for a second and think. If there is stuff smaller, if it's not emitting light, but it's still would you nothing, or would you call it dark matter? Call it dark matter, wouldn't you? Because it doesn't. It's just not.
You're coming in and out, W. Just want to let you know.
I'm not moving a bit. I hope somebody isn't getting too stressed out. So now we think about, okay, let's, for the sake of discussion, consider that maybe there is matter smaller than the matter that we can see and touch and feel and manipulate. What does that matter do? What's our relationship to it? And does it have any effect on us? And the reality is that, yes, it's there, it does exist, and it exists like a stream. If you have a log and it's drifting in a slow-moving swamp or river, and it's been there for a very long time, it becomes totally saturated with the water in the river. And so we call it waterlogged. Now, the log might be 99 and 99/10 completely saturated with the water, near the same density as the water that it's floating in, just a tiny bit more buoyant than the water that it's floating in. And so as the log is going downstream, if you were standing on that log, it might appear that the water beside you was stationary. Why? Because it's moving the same speed as you are. So to you, you don't see any movement of that water, but it actually is a stream. And it might be infinitesimally moving just a hair faster than you are because you have a little resistance. You have a little tiny bit of the log up above the surface of the water, and maybe the wind blows sideways to you. So while you're going mostly in one direction, you might be going a little bit to one side. And so what's happening is that while it's almost identical, an infinitesimal small amount difference, it does exist. Our matter world is actually saturated with very, 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 very small subatomic material. We're floating in a sea, a soup of very dense, very tiny matter, dark matter. That's the majority of the universe out there around us. The matter itself, which I'll explain in my paper at a later time, and which I've discussed with you, Joe, and Doug other times, is actually almost just a puffy form of this blowing up. And so I'm not going to lose all your listeners. We're going to leave this momentarily, but I just want you to think about this for a second. So you could have a material that's right there that you actually are infused with, saturated with, that's more real, more present, even denser than the material that you think of yourself as being made up by. And by the way, as far as energy, oh my gosh, the amount of potential energy in the dark matter is so great. And I explained some of this in some of what I've done with some of my colleagues at different times, and the numbers are just astonishing. I won't bore your audience right now, but it'll be in the paper when we do it. 1 cup of dark matter, if its energy potential, the BTUs of energy contained in it, were fully used, 1 cup has enough energy in it to boil all the water off of all the oceans of the entire world instantaneously, turned to heat. Forget nuclear bombs. That's why when you hear about Star Trek and the matter-antimatter reactor, what are they doing? They're popping matter into existence, and they're pulling matter down to a subatomic size. And that conversion of energy is this driver for these warp drive engines. But now let's think about this for a second.
All right, did we lose you? Somehow? Did we? W, are you still there? Joe, is he still connected?
All
right, folks. Look, while we're waiting for him to come back, I got to tell you, this is this is necessary background. It seems tedious, but I got to tell you, you've got to understand this because this does lead into the bigger picture. You might ask yourself, what? Joe and I were talking about this before. Joe, and you were wondering, I think we were both wondering at one point during one of our previous discussions, how does this all connect with what's happening today? I mean, with what's really going on today, but stay with us.
Yeah, and we do have W back here, and we'll bring him back on. So, guys, just if you don't like the science aspect of it, just hang on. It does get much better. And you're back, W.
All right. And I hope your people are staying with us. I mean, I know this is hard information because your eyes are glazing over and it sounds like, where are we going with this? I think we'll tie it together, but you need to be able to kind of visualize some of these thoughts and ideas, and we have to be able to, it's like I was making something here the other day, and I had to cut out a number of pieces of different types of material, and while I had all these various pieces, almost 1,000 pieces of different materials, different stuff, and it looked like scraps of everything. And then I had to start assembling and putting together and gluing and attaching and matching, and all of a sudden, out of all that stuff, evolved this incredible machine. And so we need to take all these various scraps and try to assemble them at the end, but you first have to get the pattern cut out for each one of these scraps of material so that you have the basic pieces. So that's what we're doing right now.
Right on.
So stay with us. I'm hoping that we aren't losing people, but I think this is an important conversation. And, for those that need it, White House. Okay, there we go. So we talked politics for a second. Now we get back to the conversation. I know some people needed to hear that to wake them back up. So now we say, okay, so there's stuff that makes up our world, but we can't see it. But it's everywhere around us, totally infused in us. And it's even more real than the stuff that we see because it's much denser, it's much finer, it's much more powerful. And in fact, if you were to say that you could perfectly use the dark matter just contained in your own body, besides boiling all the oceans of the world off with just a cup of it that might be the size of your fist, the amount of it in your whole body could blow a whole world to smithereens. That's how much energy is packed within your being. But it's just out of reach. Just right there adjacent to you, right there infused in you, but how do you access it? And what does it mean? And, how is it relevant to us in this physical world? If I can't touch it, feel it, grab it, manipulate it, what's it matter? What's the matter with the matter? What's it matter? It's not relevant to me. I can hear a lot of your people out there in the audience saying that right now. I don't know how this applies. So let's go back to consciousness. If your consciousness actually isn't residing in your brain, isn't recorded in your brain, where is it recorded? If your body is in fact in a way an avatar, like the movie Avatar, where a person would get into a machine cocoon, and then his thoughts, his physics, his brain manipulations were remote transmitted to a body at a distance that thought, moved, acted, reacted according to its input, its stimuli, remote control, an avatar. What if you are, in a sense, that way, and yet your consciousness isn't parked on the other side of Pluto? It's right there within the zone of your body, but in that dark matter. Very real. It's recorded on a recording medium that is right there beside you, right there within you. It's just of a size, of a material that you can't understand within the purely physical matter realm, matter of the atomic scale and above. Doesn't mean it's not there. It just means it's not of a size that we normally think of and talk about and work with and can manipulate. How can we prove that subatomic matter exists? And if it does exist, does it have an impact, a measurable impact on the way our world works and the way we work? Well, that's why we had a guest on like Richard Hoagland last week. Because what he has done, what he has brought to the conversation is absolutely astonishing. He learned that he could take a device that other physicists had also learned and used, which was, in this particular case, amongst other things, and I mean, Richard is just a gem. He's an astonishing guy, and I hope all of your listeners pay very close attention to the work he's done, because he takes data points that are real. No, he's not coming at this as a Christian. He's not coming at this as a heathen either. He's coming at it as a scientist. If I was out at a crime scene, would I only want the Christian detective to do the investigation, or do I want the guy that's coming out looking at the data and evaluating the evidence somewhat, without any bent one way or another? I want the guy that's just looking at the evidence and giving me raw information, just the facts, ma'am. That's Richard. He's looking at data, information, and trying to make sense of it and present stuff that's repeatable, that other people can look at. And then you can bring your opinions, your own background, your religion, your philosophies, other stuff into the equation. But he has some conclusions that he draws, but he separates those conclusions from the raw data so that others can look at it and see if they agree on the basic raw data. They can agree to disagree or agree on what it means. So what Richard has done is he has gone out and taking a Accutron watch, and you've got to listen to this. This is very important, because I'm going to bring it up to the DNA and to the physics and to the matter world and to the politics of the world around us. Hopefully before we're done.
This would be a good time to take a break, as we're at the top of the hour, and when we come back, we'll let you start to lay that out.
14th edition of the Hagmann and Hagmann Report. Our special guest, W, the Intelligence Insider. If you're wondering what any of this has to do with intelligence or how it connects the dots, just hang with us. I guarantee you will be absolutely astounded when you hear how this is all tied together. Some things, if you've read Paul McGuire's book, lot of Steve Quayle's work. If you've read, I mean, you name it, you're just gonna be astounded because it does come together in ways that you won't see coming. With that, W, thanks for hanging with us during the break. It's yours. Go ahead.
All right, and I know this is tedious for some of the audience. Others are maybe hanging on every word. Bear with us, it is coming together. So what Richard Hoagland is doing takes an Accutron watch. What is an Accutron watch? What was neat about this Accutron watch, it was advertised back in the early 60s at the beginning of the space program as being the most accurate watch in the world. And it used a basic physical action, which was the motion of a tuning fork. You see, a tuning fork, for those of you that haven't really thought about it or looked at it, what it is, it's like a big Y. It's a stem, think of the letter Y, and then it's got almost a U at the top of the stem. And that U are equal lengths. So you go up this stem, and then you take an equal measure going this way and an equal measure going that way, and it goes up to a tip. And what you do with the tuning fork, of course, is you strike it or energize it, whatever way you're going to do it. And when the energy wave moves along the metal, just think of a pond or a bathtub. And if you were to take a bathtub and drop a rock right in the center, the ripple of the water would emanate out from the rock, and it would go to one side of the bathtub and to the other side of the bathtub, or a bowl, let's say, something that's exactly the same all the way around. Because bathtubs sometimes have a slope on one end and they're flat on the other, so maybe a bowl's a better thing to use for a comparison. So if you put that rock and dropped it in precisely in the center, that ripple would go out to the rim of the bowl, and then it would reflect and come back to the center, and from all the way around, and it would come back and meet at the center at exactly the same time. Well, an energy wave on a tuning fork, or a sound wave, or any kind of an energy form you might think of, travels along that material, goes out to the tip, reflects, and comes back in. And as it hits, it reverberates, whom, whom, whum. And just like the water in the bowl, it keep moving out, coming back in, meet at the center, kablink, and it go back out, come back in, meet at the center, kablink. And it's reflecting back and forth, back and forth. That time for that signal to go to the end of the tuning fork and back through that matter is a very precise amount of time. But it doesn't vary because the energy goes to the material with a very set speed, a set time. And it's, on the physics, very predictable. So with an Accutron watch that's energized by a little tiny battery causing it to vibrate, the oscillations, the movements of those tuning forks swaying back and forth under the energy of this wave going down to the tip and back is a very precise number that's very predictable, that doesn't vary. And so they would claim that an Accutron watch was accurate to within a very tiny space of time over an entire year. And on the surface of the planet here, it would always be the same. They'd work great. And for a period of time, those Accutron watches were used in spacecraft going up into space with the astronauts. They were one of the sponsors, and all the clocks around the control rooms, Accutron, Accutron. Advertising. Everybody wanted to be in on the space program. Tang, you're going to eat the same food as the astronauts, etc. So Accutron had to be in there. Only thing is, they found out that when these guys went to space with these Accutron watches, the watches wouldn't keep time the same way. And the short version of this story, which Richard tells so well, and which he has articles in his website that go into minute detail on and are worth looking at. He found, and others found before him, that there was some other physics involved that was changing the way that this Accutron tuning fork worked under certain conditions. And early on, they couldn't figure out what it was. They just knew it was there. They saw the effect. They didn't know what was causing it or how to control it precisely, but they could see something was happening that defied known physics. It didn't defy physics. It defied known physics. They didn't know any better at the time. Or if somebody did know, the guys that were actually using it in those places there at NASA weren't in the loop. They weren't on the approved list. And so quietly those Accutron watches were taken away and the clocks were taken off the wall and everything, and it all went away. But some people stayed on that because what they realized was that they were seeing some physics that didn't make sense with the tools that they normally use. That just, you couldn't explain with electricity, magnetism, or photonic activity. They couldn't find anything that could affect the motion of that tuning fork using the tools in their toolbox. Well, does that mean that it's voodoo? Does that mean that it's non-existent and we just need to, pray against it now? No, there's some there. There's something real, something tangible there. Well, skipping down the pages through the story, Richard also found that when he used this Accutron watch at certain sites around the planet where he has gone and mapped it, at some of these pyramid structures, and on certain dates, certain timing of celestial events. For example, one of the most notable was when Venus crossed between us and the sun. So Venus eclipsed the sun. And when he took a measuring location on one of the Great Pyramids in Mexico and measured how his tuning fork Accutron watch worked at that pyramid, while Venus was transiting across the sun, because he has a very, very sensitive computer measuring device, he found that the tuning fork moved at a different rate of speed. Now, in normal physics, there's no electrical wire connecting Venus to his computer and his tuning fork. The amount of energy from light from the sun and the disruption of Venus crossing in front of the sun, there's no measuring system, there's no tool, there's no mechanism that could have thrown his tuning fork off sufficiently to be measurable in the way that he saw it. And he noticed very precise instants, moments of disruption. Right as Venus barely touched the edge of the sun before it started to cross in front of it was a chime moment. And that chime, like ringing a bell, bam! In the tuning fork's motion, it began to wildly gyrate back and forth and acted just totally bizarre in ways that you just couldn't explain in a physical matter world. The physics changed. Normal matter physics changed in ways that science, using electrons, using photons, using magnetic gauge strength, displacement, attraction, repulsion, could not explain this physical activity, this change in the way that tuning fork vibrated, moved, recorded energy. As the planet transited to where it was fully in the sun, there was another chine moment as the two edges met and before it went across the sun. And then it quieted down. It was still disrupted, but not nearly as much. As it reached the other side of the sun and began to come out of its eclipse mode, there was another chine moment. And then as the very last edge of the planet moves out across the edge of the sun, another chine moment. All of these chine moments, the physics of the way that that tuning fork vibrated changed, and you can't account for it in regular Newtonian physics. And that is important because what he was really recording, a disruption in the force, a disruption in the field, what he was really recording, what he calls a torsion event. Other terms are used by other scientists, but essentially it's a form of disruption in the flow of this stream of dark matter that we're immersed in. And this torsion event is important for two reasons. Number one, the fact that he has found a way to measure and map and track this subatomic field using the tools available to us, essentially seeing, a disruption in the way our tools operate. Not that our tools could directly manipulate it, but they could be affected by it in a way that we could see and measure and test and know. And he found that at certain sites on the earth, at certain locations, be it these pyramid structures and other timing, not just locations, but timing, celestial events, that it was more present, more easily observed. Not that there wasn't a torsion effect all the time, but during those particular instances, it was easier to see and observe it and observe the disruption in it. So now we go back to some of our earlier conversation, and we say, okay, so there's material that we can't see, but we're immersed in it, and it's this dark matter, and it's infused in us, it's all around us. Where's consciousness? Is it conceivable that it's recorded somewhere there, that the there is there? Not necessarily in the physical realm that we're in. We're just remote operated or affected by things in that torsion realm, if we'll use that word that Richard has coined and used so well. So that torsion signal is constantly influencing us. See, what he's measuring is a disruption in the signal, a distortion in the signal. But the signal is always present. Like you on a piece of driftwood, you're in the stream is continuing to move. You might hit a blade of grass, you might hit another log in the stream and bump off of it and feel a jolt or a movement. Well, that's these celestial events. But now, let's think about this for a second. If consciousness isn't technically in your physical body, it's somewhere adjacent, another heaven, if you will, and we're just operating in this body like an avatar, how are we connected one to the other? Now, in our aircraft, we have very specific coded devices in the transmitter and the receiver. It doesn't just send a radio signal from one to the other. Although that radio signal data has information, I don't want somebody else commandeering my aircraft, taking over control of it. So the signal is coded so that whether it's another friendly aircraft or an enemy trying to take control of the aircraft, that signal is encoded in such a way that only my aircraft and only my transmitter communicate between each other. Very unique, highly encoded. difficult to break. If we look at ourselves, at our being, and if we say consciousness resides outside the body, how do we communicate with our bodies from our conscious location in a way that it's not overwritten, hot-wired, tapped into, or spoken over by adjacent signals from somebody else? And I would propose to you that it's the DNA. Now, one of the interesting things about the DNA, when we look at the DNA, the picture that most people have in their mind is the double helix. The double helix is two strands that wind and twist and coil around each other. Two strands are connected side to side. What does it look like when we look at those strands? Technically, the more simplistic model, but relatively accurate, is we look at it as though, let's take the letter T, and you take a T and you turn it on its side, and you take another T and you turn it on its side, and you put it together so that the T, the stem, the base of the T on one side, touches the outer limb of the T on the other side. And when you put T's side to side to side to side, alternating back and forth, in the middle it looks like ladder rungs going up. So that you would create a ladder made out of T's with rungs going across the middle, and that's the T portion. But then let's look at the way that it's made up. These are proteins, these are materials and sugars that make up these strands. And another way of looking at it isn't necessarily to say that those are T's connecting side to side in those strands, but to say that they're Y's. They're not perfectly flat, although the models show them that way. They do kind of have a little bit of shape, and they vary depending on what exact material is in each little piece of information. But each of those T's or Y's has a particular code of the way the materials are lined up in them. And so they, for the sake of discussion, are like little tiny tuning forks that vibrate at their own particular individual signal or note. When you hit a tuning fork, this one's this size, it makes this sound. This one's bigger, it makes this much lower sound. This one's smaller, it makes this much higher sound. So if you had a whole bunch of little tuning forks and you put them together side to side, alternating back and forth in this ladder-type arrangement, and thought of the DNA strands as tuning forks all the way up, each of them hitting their own unique little combination note. And then you say, well, if I have tuning forks side by side, and I have them all vibrating, tend to affect the note of the one adjacent to them ever so slightly, especially when you have a whole bunch of them. And so all of these tuning forks hitting their individual notes tied together make a particular sound or signal or song or music that is totally unique, because what? No two people's DNA is exactly the same unless you're a clone. And even clones vary just ever so slightly here and there, but they're closer together to being an exact match. Nearly, almost indescribably minute variations, but very, very, very close. So now imagine if that DNA strand, of which your body is made up of trillions of strands of DNA throughout all your cells, essentially amounts to a note that's your unique note, your unique music that you make, and your transmitter can communicate with your receiver individually and no one else. Now your consciousness resides between you and your body. You are tied together by this silvery thread umbilical cord to this physical body with your consciousness right now. And then it may be that some people, be it a mother or a twin or a clone, share some joint consciousness with one another because they're so close together on the note that they strike that there's some overplay. Perhaps you've been by a radio station transmitter and you've got your radio turned to a particular channel. And as you get closer to this other radio station's transmitter, suddenly you start to hear some of their music and talk coming over your radio because their signal is so strong it overdrives even into your signal. Sometimes we steer a radio signal by having transmitters that are focused in a certain direction, or on the receiver, we put a receiver that's aimed a certain direction to receive more clearly a signal at a very great distance. And so there's ways to maybe accentuate or enhance the performance and the communications ability from one to the other. But now, once again, we're talking matter, electrons, photons, magnetics. But what if the communication signal is none of those? What if the communication signal is a torsion signal? It's a physics that's not normal physics the way you've been taught and raised to believe. It is measurable and it is detectable. And it is manipulable if you understand how to do it. So if you were communicating, let's say in the jungle 1,000 years ago or in some remote places here on the planet, maybe you use smoke signals and drums because that's what's available to you. You don't have an electronic radio transmitter or receiver situation, so you got to use drums and smoke signals. Does it mean that radio systems don't exist? Well, 1,000 years ago, probably didn't exist. Does it mean they can't exist? No, we know that now. So, what do we have here? We have now established that there's a very good likelihood that a physics is real and exists and is provable that it exists, that is right around us all the time. And somebody figured that out. And some of how it works, we might consider spiritual and everything. Well, what's the word? Still based on real physics, real stuff. The spiritual dimension doesn't mean that it's totally just imaginary, vaporous, whatever. Paul, when he said he was caught up into heaven, he didn't know to which heaven it was. He thought to the seventh heaven. The seventh heaven, there's like multiple dimensions, multiple truths. There's not just one heaven. What could he be talking about there? So then we come back and we look at this situation and we think about consciousness. And now I have to go somewhere else for a minute and add one more part to the table of parts as we try to assemble this puzzle. Let's imagine a time somewhere far out into the future. Quail is correct. And mankind is allowed to continue to evolve the way they're headed this second. What is he saying he sees in his divinely inspired mind as the future of mankind if these people are allowed to do what they want to do, what they're trying to do, what they're pushing us to do. He sees a future of transhumanists transferred into what? This mating, this mixing, this merging of machine and man. It might start out with a mechanical limb, and then it might be added to with an eyeball or a contact that is somehow able to see better and see in low light and download information that you can see optically from the internet. It could be more direct. It could be some type of a chip that you plug right into your brain, and suddenly you now can speak French instantly without learning a thing. It's just bang, it's in your brain. You can have math. You could have something else, some enhanced mental capability, processing capability.
W, let me just interject here, because I know a lot of our listeners are reading his newest book, Xenogenesis. If you are reading that book, you know exactly what W is talking about right now. I just wanted to interject that, and if not, it'd be a good time to think about getting Xenogenesis. But it's not an ad for the book, but it's to aid in understanding. That's all. Go ahead, W.
So now we think, moving out into the future, 50 years, its limbs and its eyeballs, 100 years, its plug-in chips for enhanced mental calculations and knowledge. In 500 years, it's eternal life. Download consciousness into a machine. And maybe it's not 500 years. Maybe portions of it are being downloaded right now. Perhaps you record your consciousness in such a way that it can be able to exercise itself out in the machine as the capabilities show up, 500 years from now. There's people who have had their bodies freeze-dried at the instant of death or just before they would normally die, knowing that they had cancer or something else, and preserving their body in this state, knowing that technology continues to improve every day and paying to have their body held in this time capsule so that they can be brought back to life by some technology they don't fully understand right now and reanimated if the technology improves to that point to cure their cancer or to somehow bring their body back to life, inject some new blood in it and get the tissues going again and reanimate them. Whether it be 100 years in the future or 500 years in the future or 1,000 years in the future. Isn't that what the Egyptians were trying to do? Preserve that body well enough that somewhere down in the future they thought they could be reanimated. Perhaps they understood something that we only now are beginning to understand. That their consciousness exists outside the body. That the body is an avatar of your consciousness. And that it's connected by a very specific note or signal in the DNA. And if your physical body dies in this realm, if you can reanimate that DNA at some later point in time, you could have access to that knowledge bank, that data bank that is you, again, in this world. But you live eternally. Your being, everything that makes you up, is still there. You see, when that dog was cloned. And both the clone from the original material and the clone of the clone knew a trick that only the first clone had been taught. That established that the consciousness still existed somewhere and was unique and could be tapped into again, that its data bank was still there, even though the physical dog had originally died. Imagine a future, some distant place out there where mankind's abilities reach some incredible high point where your consciousness downloaded in some manner into a robot, into a being, into a machine. And in that machine, you don't know an end of life. If the machine has a part that breaks, you put a new part on it. If some of the consciousness doesn't work quite right, you unplug that, plug in a new one, and reprogram it.
And I don't know if you saw an article that was on Drudge today from Stephen Hawking talking about how the future of artificial intelligence and man combining could be the greatest and last step that we take. And it also said in the article it could be the biggest irreversible mistake ever made.
And this is exactly what you're talking about, by the way.
Well, let's think about that, Doug. That's a beautiful point. And it goes right to the heart of everything. But let's come back to that in a minute, because you're so close. But let's think about a couple of things. Now let's go to box of chocolates. Here I am looking at what is purported to be triple-strand DNA. The lie was that somebody was superior because they had triple-strand DNA as opposed to double-strand DNA. That was what they were taught. That's what they believed. And that triple-strand DNA made them different and in a positive way, better, superior. Strand DNA gave them certain knowledge, access, rights, because everybody that wasn't triple strand was different. And triple versus double, well, everybody knows, more is better, right? So the question was, is it true? I mean, the technology to look at DNA has only really come on in the last 30, 40 years in any great, strong measure. So this was still an emerging science a long time ago. And so to look at the DNA, to try and get somebody that had the capability of looking at the DNA at this level, it's a big deal. Finding the right guy that would have access that could even understand what they were looking at was a big deal. And if you did just basic looks, you didn't see any what's normal to me. You had to know what you were looking for and where you were looking for it at, and you had to sift, and it wasn't everywhere. But for a moment, let's think about those people, those groups. How would they even have known or thought and have conveyed one to another over generations that they were different in some very essential, some critical, some unknowable way at the DNA level? And yet they knew that they were genetically somehow different in a way that was not totally obvious to everyone. But they knew, and they had knowledge, and they had to pass it down. They didn't use terms DNA. They didn't use that kind of terminology They just knew that there was something different, and the difference was where? In the blood. The blood was different. How it worked was different. It could be merged with other blood, but you could have children, you could interact with other people, marry and take in marriage. Sometimes you would get something different, and at certain times it was key to get something different. And there was a need to preserve a unique identity, one generation to the next, within your bloodline, because there was something about the blood that made you different, and you needed a pure bloodline to preserve that and accentuate it out into the future for some reason known only to your ancestors and to who might come down the road to use that knowledge to regain some high point that they had known before. You see what Richard says on his website, going where someone has gone before.
Yeah, and if I could jump in here with the bloodline, if you read a lot of these Illuminati families, a lot of their writings, and you really get into beyond the cover and the ending, they talk a lot about their bloodline. They talk about how their support structure comes from the knowledge gained from generation after generation of passing down of information that they say is to protect their bloodline. And they even go as far as some say that they can and used to communicate without words this information from bloodline to bloodline. And the best way I've heard it explained is they believe each individual who's alive today is a placeholder for the bloodline as a whole or the family as a whole.
That's correct. Let's think about this. One of the interesting things in these secret societies, these families, are these rituals that they follow. Very bizarre. For example, some of these ancient sites, one in England in particular, which Loomis has talked about quite extensively, are these groves or sites where they have stones lined up in very precise ways to follow the movement of the sun across the sky season to season, and to map out and chart the movements of planets in this starscape above us. And one of the most critical planets that is followed is Venus. And this ceremony that is conducted every 40 years with precision as Venus eclipses in this one location at a very precise time. And the light from Venus is lined up to come down into this chamber precisely, and even though it's just at dusk or dawn, as it comes down through the opening of this chamber, this long shaft, for a brief period of time, it passes in such a way it shines literally like a sun, like a light bulb inside the cavern, because it's like a pinpoint, like a laser signal coming straight in to that chamber. And what was happening inside that chamber at that time? This was about these sexual acts, and virgins and the high priest would have sex with these girls and these women during that week and those days, and in the high point of those moments on those particular days, with particular emphasis at that time and hour when Venus would pass right in front of that location. And the light from Venus would travel down that shaft precisely like a laser into that chamber area. And they had to have sex to commemorate that moment. How bizarre is that? What are you talking about? Heathens, heathens, heathens! But wait a second. You're thinking of it as a person who measures with light and electricity at the matter level. What about subatomic matter? What did Hagmann find? There's a torsion signal, and there's a disruption in the torsion signal during those events. And there's ways to focus that torsion signal. And in the ancient world, if you didn't understand all the physics and nobody could explain to you torsion and subatomic materials and everything else, how would you preserve some knowledge of how some of the physics works and use that energy to your advantage at some critical point? So now we look at box of chocolates. And what did we see? A filament, another strand. It looks like another strand, DNA-like, and yet it's not a full strand. It's just a little short blurb of it. Nano-sized. And if you look at it and you say, but by dimension, by length, by weight of material, you cannot record enough information on it to seem to make much of a difference. You see, in the early days of recording, there was what was called wire recorders. And so a piece of wire was run beside magnetic heads, and they were imprinted with a magnetic distortion on that wire, and then if you played it back, it would make a sound just like it recorded. And so it was called wire recording. Then we progressed from that. It was used for, covert purposes, for people to even realize you could record voices and stuff. Then we switched to magnetic tape, which had more space on it to record more information, a wider band, more depth of information, more detail of information in a very small size. And then we went from the magnetic tape, these big reels, to small tapes with greater metal density, record more detailed information, more information, finer grains of magnetic material on the tape. Then finally we reached the limits of magnetic tape, reel-to-reel cassette, and we said, well, we've got to go to another form of recording data, recording information. And in that early version, it was recorded analog, which was waveforms. Same with the record players. It was an analog waveform. It was like a wave, a disruption in the surface of the water. And so we saw those wave heights up and down. And we switched to digital, zeros and ones, a binary system. In those zeros and ones, we do it in packets of 6. And so you could have 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, or 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And you could have groups of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, and 0, 1, 1, 1, and you'd start adding them all together, and all of those equal the letter A. And eventually we got smarter and smarter about the way that we recorded this information, and we could pack it more densely, more tightly, and that's how you could go from the way we recorded analog, where you could have just a little bit of movie information on a great big huge cassette, to having several movies recorded on one little tiny DVD, and eventually to little tiny chips in a computer, multiple movies, unbelievable density of information in a very small space. Even with all that, we know that there's a limit to how much information you can pack into a piece of given matter. So when we look at this thread that was there, intermingled, intertwined with the DNA strands, that was sitting there seemingly attached at various places, we're going, well, that doesn't seem like it could have enough information to actually be something different. But it doesn't have to be all the information on the strand if consciousness resides inside the body. What if your consciousness is somehow trapped because your body is physically dead and you want to get into another body so you can reanimate yourself and express yourself? You need to get your DNA reactivated. Do you suppose that those pharaohs, like our modern day people that are having their bodies freeze-dried, are thinking that somewhere down the road, because of some new capability, might have their DNA merged with new beings at some later point in time and they could partially live again in some new DNA form? Their DNA could be preserved well enough. See, the organs weren't preserved. They didn't expect the organs to be. Their teeth and their bones were preserved. The DNA material inside their bodies was preserved well enough to last down through the centuries till the technology arrived to take some of that DNA, reactivate it if their ancestors in the future, their progeny, their offspring, understood, hey, I'm saving myself. Preserve me. When the time comes, reanimate me. I want to live again. And imagine us right now. What's being offered to us? Transhumanism. If we go down this road and start this process, at some point in the future, we'll be able to download our consciousness, our being, into machines that will allow us to live from wherever it is that we really are and express ourselves in this realm of existence essentially forever, permanently. But now I have one other question for you. What if we're not talking about the future? What if this already happened in the past? Beings, creatures, humanoid, not human because they aren't descendants of Adam, but beings nonetheless, humanoid beings, living creatures, had evolved, had grown, had become so technologically advanced that they once before were able to download their consciousness into machines. What would they have built? What if 10,000 years was just a starting point in your life? Think of how much we learn in a few years, few decades. Adam and Eve living almost 1,000 years. Imagine what they learned. The greatest scientist in mankind's history was Adam. He named all the animals in the garden, all the plants. He was a physicist genius. But imagine if he lived 10,000 years, 100,000 years. What would his knowledge and capability in the physical realm be? And what could he have built? Well, I mean, the things, the machines could be unbelievable. We talk about a material with the nano world where instead of building a 57 Chev from scratch, going out and taking iron and molding it into strips of metal that could be stamped out into a bumper and then socketed together with bolts and rubber and hinges and everything else, what if I could take a pool of goo that had all of the material necessary, chrome and iron, biological material, and I had little tiny, itsy-bitsy, teeny-weeny machines, nano machines. Each one of them does a very precise little teeny, itsy-bitsy job. And electron, matter, atoms could be combined together in very precise ways. But if I have to have the knowledge inside of each one of those nano machines, the nano machine is so small you can only put a little teeny bit of information in it. So what do I have to have? I have to have an understanding, a knowledge, a designer outside of the nano machines that communicates to them so that they work in unison, but from a remote location where the capability, the data banks, the map, the blueprint is much more substantial. The little nano machine just does what it's told to do, the way that it's told to do it by some remote operating system. And piece by piece, atom by atom, it builds a 57 Chev for you. It might take a day, it might take 100 years. In that realm, it might not at a certain point matter. It probably could happen very quickly if you have the materials. And it could be, let's say you had little nano machines planted here on the earth, and they had to go search and find iron or gold or silica. Well, they'd go in the seawater, they'd go into the plants, they'd go grab all the various stuff, and because they're nano and they travel very slowly, it might take them quite a while to accumulate the materials. Maybe it takes them 1,000 years, maybe it takes them 10,000 years to bring everything back to an assembly point and put it together. But over time, they'd get pretty good at it, and they'd eventually build it. You know, we've talked about, because I deal with my space stuff, would I send a huge rocket ship miles long with everything needed, a whole civilization of people, to go to some planetary system we discovered if it was only 20 light years away, but we could only travel at, you know, a quarter of light speed, so that would mean it's 80 years away, a lifetime or more than a lifetime potentially. So we're going to send everybody in this ship. We've got to have enough material. It's got to be able to sustain itself for all that time. Or rather than build a miles-long spaceship, what if I built a little tiny, itsy-bitsy spaceship that was the size of a Greyhound bus, or maybe the size of a softball? And I had all the programming and all the information in there and some basic tools. And then I send it over there. And when it gets there, it goes and finds an asteroid, and it grabs the metals out of it. And it finds another asteroid that's got other stuff, and maybe it finds atmosphere or an ocean at some planet that's there. And it assembles everything, builds it together, and it builds a system to go do its research, its exploration, and gather its notes and send it back to us. Maybe it builds itself there as opposed to building it all here. Maybe it takes less time to build that little teeny spaceship here than it takes to build a miles-long one here to send it out there and accumulate all the propulsion materials. Because to push a little teeny spaceship all that distance across the solar system or galaxy is simple. I don't need all the energy. I don't need all the displacement. I don't need all the construction time. Let the construction time take place there, as opposed to over here. I send all of that there that's going to be expended along the way. But then I think down through not just distance, but time. What if I knew that my destruction was imminent, and I was highly advanced, and I knew that I was about to be destroyed in a way that I couldn't escape easily, fully intact. And I had to download my consciousness in some way to preserve it into machines and some kind of arms and limbs that might help put me back together at some point down the road that could be filtered out in little tiny machines to go other places, to gather the materials to reassemble me at some later point in time. Because I'd become a machine. Isn't that what Steve Quayle is talking about? Becoming a machine where your humanity, your human identity, your flesh and blood identity are lost. We hear about it in the sci-fi movies. They say, biological life form, silicon life form. Silicon life form? What's a silicon life form? I have a silicon putty that I use to keep the water out of the cracks in my shower. What are you talking about, silicon? Well, what are computers made of? Silica, sand, glass. A silicon life form is a recording of data on a computer chip as opposed to data on a biological recorder. This is different and is the same as a wire recorder or a tape recorder and a DVD. Information recorded on two different types of media. So then we look at it and we go, what if the past is prologue? What Steve's seeing out in the future already happened. What is Richard Hoagland talking about? Going where someone has gone before. But you know what the problem is? In that interim, if some prior civilization existed here, if there was some humanoid presence, not human because they're not direct descendants of Adam and Eve, but humanoid. What if they lived here before and were destroyed themselves? And there was some echo, some remnant of their history all around us. What would it look like? What would it be? If they were highly, highly evolved, is it possible that, everything was destroyed, or is it some of it still here around us? And how would it be recorded? Where would it be? What would it look like? How would it express itself? And what would it represent? It would represent their consciousness and their access from their consciousness into the physical realm, from the data storage banks, from the consciousness center, where we reside also, or maybe a slightly different one, but parallel to ours. Paul talked about different heavens. So then you think about the physics, and you think about these families and how they've recorded certain rituals into how they live from generation to generation. And I was talking to you earlier, Doug, about a tribe and tribes down in the South Pacific. And what happened with them was that when World War II occurred, the armies went down and they would occupy these islands. And first people in there, they'd be these Navy Seabees, and there'd be communications people, and they would go in, land, seeming coming out of nowhere, and to these natives that are living, in the past, in very rural, civilization, very, very low-level civilization, not technically evolved. They see these people come in dressed in uniforms with materials that they've never even dreamed of, these kinds of cloths and materials. They've never seen anything like this. They're wearing grass skirts, if they're wearing anything at all. And these people would come in and they'd make a little hut with a grass roof on it, and they'd put these machines in there, and they'd have radios that, they're just a box, and it's boxes with cords on them that, hemp, ropes, and they have things they put on their ears, and then they talk certain funny language, certain code words, and they do things, and there's a certain ritual, and the papers have to be laid out in a very precise way. And then suddenly, after they do the ritual in that little booth at that desk, they look up, and out of the sky come planes, and they land, and then people come out. Parachutes are dropped. Supplies and equipment come out of nowhere. And these people, they were there for a period of time, and then the war moved, and they went on. And the tribes that were there tried to duplicate what they saw, and it's called the cargo cults. And we come back years later to those same islands, having not visited them for 20, 30 years. And what do we find? The high priest in the radio communications hut, tapping out codes on the transmitter, speaking in the mic a certain way, looking up to the sky to see if the gods have returned. They preserved a ritual. They're called cargo cults because they thought that the guy in the room, in the radio room, in that shack, was the reason everything else occurred. They didn't understand the physics. They didn't understand the outside world. They recorded it their own way. They created a ritual around something that had nothing to do with reality. They didn't understand what they were really seeing. And what we know about that filament, that nano thread, be the third strand of DNA, it's not a being, it's not a parasite in the true sense of the word, it's an antenna. And it short circuits, it cross wires the existing DNA to create a slightly different note. Different enough that, like a virus in a computer, taking over a computer, cross-wiring data and information and finding a hidden code, sequence, capability, can take over the way the DNA expresses and builds and constructs and does. And the way consciousness is downloaded into that DNA. It alters the DNA in an infinitesimally small way. And the energy mechanism for it can work with and express itself using electromagnetic photonic energies. It's very inefficient. Why? Because the DNA itself doesn't work primarily on electromagnetic photonic information transfer. When Edgar Mitchell went up into space, one of the experiments he did on the way to the moon and back was he tried looking at cards, thinking about a card that he was looking at, and a man on the ground in another room would be looking at, in his mind, what he might see that Mitchell was seeing and try to write it down. And they found out, and the Russians had found this out previously, and there's been other experiments that go into some of these details, there's certain times of the day when, beyond just randomness, there appears to be greater clarity of communication, telepathic information transfer from one person to another, where distance doesn't matter. You can be in the next room, you can be all the way out at the moon, and at certain sweet spots, information is transmitted one mind to another more efficiently, more directly. Well, what is that? That's times when the torsion signal is clearer, more direct, like a laser. And something that operates based on a torsion signal is able to be energized more directly. So, what if we were looking at nano machines from some pre-existing time that were still here present in our environment, had been intermingled in with DNA, human DNA, but because the signal strength that energizes it is random, static noise. And it's only really clear at certain times during certain events. Wouldn't you want to try and get the people, the natives, to operate in precise ways during those events, maybe encapsulated in a ritual so that they preserve in ways that they couldn't explain in the detail, and you can't explain it all to them, and somebody forget to pass along a certain piece of information. So you have to create the ritual edifice and chamber and isolate out the signal, and then do these rituals in such a way, because during that torsion event, that nano thread becomes energized, activated, moves more readily, and can be transmitted being to being down through time. And certain bloodlines are more attuned naturally and by breeding to that. But now let's think about what else are we looking at in our society today. We see and we talk about families working together, a hidden hand behind the scenes, managing the planet towards some future event, some new world order, some greater organization. And in those families, they have an understanding amongst themselves that they are different. They understood it, and it's been conveyed at different times in different ways. More recently, triple-strand DNA. Prior to that, a noble bloodline. But they have believed that they were aliens that fell to this earth. They somehow are trapped here because their ancestors came to earth and had to rebuild it in some way to just survive. Imagine our world today if something like an EMP happens. Could you build your car by yourself here today? How long before that car wouldn't run anymore? Because you can't get parts or you can't get gas. Name all the devices around you. Maybe you have your computer protected and stored in such a way, and you'd have solar collectors and everything else, but eventually it is unusable anymore. Something happens and you can't repair it, and the technology to repair it doesn't exist. It gets ground up. A couple of floods and all the technology that existed is wiped away and gone. All the buildings gone. And if we're talking thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, it gets wiped out. What you saw as a pyramid at one era might look like just a mountain in some later era. But imagine a world where technology maybe was where we are right now, plus 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, or 100,000 years. Those are blips in the history of our galaxy. Blips. What would we build? Machines the size of the moon, 20, 40, 50 miles deep of buildings and computers and stuff. And what are we finding there? What's Richard talking about? What do those photographs show? Just that. What do the Indian culture record with the Vimanu? Skyships that could destroy whole cities. And it even shows what their power system looked like and describe a power system based on Mercury propulsion system. What was it that came out in the ejecta when we impacted the moon that Richard talked about last week on your show? Mercury. 50-50 with water. the engines on the moon. It's a big spaceship. It's a Death Star. You're living in a junkyard. Somebody has gone there before. Does it bother your Christian understanding? Does it destroy my ability to have faith in God or trust that Christ is my Savior? They were an accursed generation. Who are these Nephilim that are right there in the first book of the Bible? Who are these giants? Where did they come from? What if? What if these giants, these humanoids who fell to earth are like angels? They are angels. Their consciousness resides in another dimension. Their avatars, we think in terms of downloading our consciousness into bodies, silicon-based life forms, computer-operated bodies. What if at some far distant future point it transferred it again into biological machines? They might be talking about trans-siliconism, reanimating themselves not in silicon machines but biological machines down the road. And our terms that we use for them could be all over the map. But yet, they are beings. They are consciousness. They exist just as we exist. But like our consciousness resides in our body, through our body, may even be adjacent in a smaller matter world right there, infused in us and around us, simultaneous, tied to our body by some silvery thread, some umbilical cord of torsion connection that we don't understand, but is every bit as real as the table in front of you. Their consciousness is tied to our world and connected thinly now, but no less connected from some ancient primordial period. And they are trying to express themselves and reanimate themselves to escape their hell because they're trapped unless they can reanimate somehow in this realm with those that have the promise of life in this realm, the inheritors of this realm that God has placed here. Those giants were an accursed generation. They were under a curse. The history that these families believe in is that they fell to earth. And even their rituals that you see right in front of you, I'll name an example, the 2012 Olympics. How did the highest-ranking member of one of those bloodline families come to the event? For all the world to see, a parachute. The Queen jumped out of the helicopter, parachuted, fell to earth, duplicating how they originally got here in the first place. Why? Because they think they're different than us. They fell to earth from their celestial locations, from their higher technological era. They got here in their lifeboat, and they're trying to build their way back to get where? Get home? Sirius? To some other star system? From this junk pile of blown, smashed out to smithereens stuff in this Edgewater place in the ocean of our galaxy? And when they got here, how did they preserve their life? They had to mate with what was here, be it apes or God's children, and create hybrids. But they always preserved the knowledge that they were different. it was suggested in a lot of the works, a lot of the writings, a lot of the information that we see that those first ones here, those ancient ones, were all male. And only through hybridization with the apes that were here were they able to preserve their DNA down to the generations to be reconcentrated at a later point in time. And if they were as intelligent, as evolved, as I'm saying to you, what if they were 50,000 years in advance of us technologically, or 10,000 or 1,000? With where we are right now with nanotechnology, would they have nanotechnology? If the moon is built out as an entire spaceship, don't you imagine that machines probably built that? It wasn't just guys with hammers and tongs peeling away. It was robots, tiny, huge, all different sizes. And they had discovered and learned how to manipulate at the nano level, and they understood torsion. And because at the torsion level, at the subatomic level, the energy density is a trillion times greater than it is at the matter level, they would use the higher density material to their advantage. So their equipment, their machines run on torsion energy. And if you're in a world where there's no machines to maintain and emit and broadcast the torsion signal coherently, you have to use and incorporate into the minds of the people that you're presented with, your hybrids that you create, for them to preserve certain understandings, so down the road, as the planet gets built back out and as the natural progression, the natural build-out of technology occurs over time, the civilization that would come, that it would focus on those torsion energy moments, those torsion energy transfer moments, where your little machines could work better, so that at some later point in time, you could be reanimated in a rebuilt world. And if you live for 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, eternally in a machine existence, 10,000 years for the planet to rebuild up to a technological level where you could begin to function normally, your normal again, well, it's 10,000 years. You expect to live 1 million. You expect to live 1 billion because you expect never to die. Any amount of time is not too long. It's just what you have to do because that's what's available to you. And preserving that knowledge in some way, arcane as it might be, is your only option. So that your progeny, your offspring, millennia removed from you, might recognize and understand and see the code that you left so you can live again and be freed from the trap, the cavern, the cave that is this memory chip in this other realm, this memory storage location, this hell where there's no ability to get out if your communication is cut off. And if you lose that last thread, that last silvery nano thread that can manipulate and control the DNA of the life forms that live there to let them know where you are, they'll never look for you. They'll never get that code again. Once the code is lost, it's gone forever. You are done. You're trapped in this other realm. So you do everything you can to maintain that, to preserve that with those that understand that. And in those families to preserve that connection to the past, because they themselves are deceived into believing that they're just a biological bloodline that's different that fell from space. They don't see the consciousness behind it all, manipulating them the way it is.
Now, W, if I can jump in here, these, fallen ones, these demons, if I'm not, sorry, I just muted myself. If I'm not mistaken, they view themselves as, to a certain extent, as prisoners and as misunderstood. They're stuck here in this world, and what you're saying is to avoid the judgment of God when this comes, because they know that they're not going to win this. They're trying to create an existence outside of the ability of God to capture their consciousness and punish them and judge them.
Well, remember, how do they identify themselves amongst themselves? Let's think about the garden for a minute. In the garden, the serpent enticed Eve to eat of the tree of knowledge. And in the course of that, which there's wonderful discussions, Doug sent me an article the other day that was fantastic, and without getting too bogged down in the minutia of the details, let's just try to think about for a second. The allegation that has been made at some levels, at a Kabbalistic level, is that Eve got pregnant first by Satan, who deceived her in the garden and impregnated her. And then she had sex with Adam and conceived Abel, and that the two were conceived essentially simultaneously in the same day or days, which physically is possible. Two different children, two genetically separate children, same mother, during the same menstrual cycle. That has been a common belief for a long time, so that Cain and Abel actually had different fathers with the same mother. And that Cain, being genetically different, looked different, was different. And that his father would come and talk with him, enticed him, said, if Abel's dead and there's no other children, you inherit the whole world. It's all yours. And he was enticed somehow to believe that story, that lie, whatever. Somehow he was, caught by that. But more importantly, and remember, for those that are saying, I don't see that in the Scripture. I don't see that anywhere in the Scripture. Understand, true or not, these people identify themselves as children of Cain. In fact, the children of Israel went to where? Canaan land, and displaced those people there and took it for themselves at God's direction. And what was there in Canaan land?
Yeah.
But think about what those giants represent. Hold on a second. Those giants are genetically different. They're humanoid, but they're not human. And yet it's called Canaan land. When Cain was exiled from his family and had to go off into a far-off city and took for himself a wife, well, where did those people come from? Oh, there were other kids that Adam and Eve had that weren't talked about in the Bible. Really? And it was a city? So we have, even now today, all sorts of archaeological records of real buildings, real cities, real stuff that's older than we can account for by the genealogy given in the Bible back to Adam and Eve. And either the Bible is true or it's false. We know all the descendants from Christ back to Adam through David. Are you saying there's a bunch of people missing or something was skipped? Or is it approximately 6,000 years? If it is, then we have real stuff that we can touch and feel and hold and look at and measure. Undeniable. And if you're going to deny it, then we probably don't need to have any more conversation. You don't want to live in the real world. Real stuff exists older than 6,000 years. Real civilizations were here over 6,000 years ago. Humanoids, not human, direct descendants of Adam. So if that's true, are they the last civilization? Were they the first one? Or were they the 10th one? Or were they the 100th one? The evidence appears to show conclusively at this point in time that the world has been destroyed multiple times. That civilization has come and gone several times here on the earth. What is different about this time from a biblical perspective, from a biblical narrative, is that God has promised, made a covenant with Adam and his seed. Notice it doesn't say Eve and her seed. It specifically says Adam and his seed. And these people, these families, these 13 families, they laugh and communicate amongst themselves and make jokes about the reptilians among us. Are the reptilian aliens here? I saw one. It's code. Reptilian is code for children of Cain. Reptilian is code for children of Satan, the other bloodline. And if that other bloodline is actually consciousness tied to some prior civilization through technology, through physics, real, honest to goodness, measurable, testable, provable physics at the torsion level, and transferable by tiny machines, manipulating the DNA, nanomachines that work best when the torsion signal is focused and strong. And the rituals are tuned based on the alignment of celestial bodies. Venus, Saturn, Mars, where the torsion signal is measurable by a guy like Richard Hoagland and others. Real physics. That then allow for that information transfer, that nanomachine transfer from one generation to the next, to manipulate the DNA, to focus the signal, to preserve the access to the physical world from that remote consciousness, wherever it may reside, into this world of ours on this planet. And I might add, it doesn't have to be, in its case, totally consciousness like ours is, where our consciousness is tied, let's say, for the sake of discussion, to the subatomic level. Perhaps its consciousness is revealed to us to be coming from someplace else. Now, think about this, Doug. When you talk with somebody and do an interrogation, an interview, a lot of times you have to question, listen, question again, listen, find discrepancies, and over time, the true nature of who they are starts to come out. What they really are thinking comes out, and you begin to piece it together, and who they really are emerges out of the cloud, but you have to let them express themselves. You have to let them go on and on and on, and then finally it starts to, okay, now I get it. Now I know who this person is. Now I know what they're thinking. Now I've got enough details, because they begin to express themselves. We see that in people's lives all the time, and suddenly you didn't understand who they were to begin with, and over years you begin to, okay, now I know who that guy is. So let's say that some prior civilization, individually and in mass, had downloaded their consciousnesses into machines. How would they express themselves over time? They would do what they know, do what they are, do what comes natural, build out machines, act like machines, with the morals of a machine. Do it because you can. Do it because you desire to. Do what comes naturally. Do what you will. Let's say that, for example, that consciousness was tied to a computer somewhere with the ability to communicate during a torsion event more precisely, more data, better bandwidth during certain events. Sometimes it's better than others. Let's say the machine was located, just for the sake of discussion, on Mars or the moon or someplace else. And as more people existed, or as the signal was more concentrated in certain individuals' DNA to be able to communicate with it, to be on the same frequency, to be operated more precisely, more accurately, that it expresses itself better. And what would it want to do? It would want to build better machines more quickly so it could reanimate itself, to build its way out of its hole that it's in. What did God do at the Tower of Babel? He confused all their languages. What were the people doing at the Tower of Babel? They were building a space program. They said, we are building a tower to the heavens. And God came down and saw what they were doing and said that if they were allowed to continue, there would be nothing that was impossible to them. So he did what? He confused their languages, their ability to communicate one to another. He confused their languages, and they couldn't speak to each other anymore intelligently, coherently. Has that been defeated in our lifetimes? Yes. What is the universal language today? Numbers. Binary numbers. The computer. In fact, if you use gematria and you just take A and say, well, that's 6, and B and that's 12, and C and that's 18, and you add up all the letters to the end of the alphabet, and then you go through and you take computer and you say, okay, C, oh, that's 18, and O, and that's this and that, and you add it up, what does it come to? 666. Its nature, its being is expressing itself. It's having a little joke. And what are we doing? We're building out its ability to retake control, to re-express itself, to reanimate itself from some remote location, be it in a subatomic world or in some silicon machine on some remote, distant location. And what is it also doing? It's trying to preserve the bloodline, because in the blood of those reptilian families, going back to its ancient ancestor at Cain and his father, if their story is true, is being merged and condensed and focused so that some future person will be so closely aligned, so closely manipulated in the way that its DNA can access and be an avatar of that signal, that it is literally the physical embodiment of that consciousness from a remote location And what does it purport to do? Save the world, save the planet, save the people. Which people? Its people. It is the reptilian Christ. For their alien hybrid race versus the children of Adam, which it sees as the invader, because God planted Adam and Eve in the garden to displace that accursed generation that would not give God the glory thereof, because they believed that their salvation could exist apart from God's blessing. They could do it whether God allowed them to or not, or was in on it or not, or blessed them or not, because they could be a machine consciousness and be eternal without connection to an eternal God. They would be like God, eternal in this realm, in this physical matter world. And that's what the whole appeal of this transhumanism that Steve Quayle talks about is to these people. If we build the machines soon enough, precisely enough, we can download our consciousness there, and we don't have to worry about an eternal hell. We don't have to worry about an eternal damnation. We'll live forever. Damn God. We will be gods.
And W, if I can back you up with scripture in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, it says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God."
The God of this world. Because they want to own the future. They do not want to be subject to God's judgment. And remember, in all of what we're saying here, if you don't agree with what I've just laid out for you, can't find it in Scripture, don't get the eschatology, don't think that this is what's really there. It doesn't matter. It's not about what you believe or even what is true or not. It's what they believe, and their belief is the driver of their actions. These families are communicating one to another. We are an alien race. We are superior to the sons and daughters of Adam. We are stuck here with these apes that we created, we gave knowledge to. They're to us like cattle are to a farmer. They live at our pleasure and discretion. And if they become a threat, cows with guns, then you need to cull the herd. Take it down a few notches. Manage the problems. Not be overrun. So that they preserve their identity. And that's why this is two different races. Whether they really exist or not, in their minds, a culture has been preserved, has been inculcated by some satanic genius to believe that they're different and to operate as though they're different, and they must protect themselves from the rest of us. And the life is in the blood. You know, for them, in order to preserve themselves, they had to hybridize. Why? Because they were under a curse. And in order to escape the curse, in their minds, what they had to do was hybridize with the humans that were under God's blessing. What happened at the flood? The earth was filled with violence. And it says that Noah alone was perfect and without sin in all of his generations. And then it lists his ancestors back to Adam. He alone, he wasn't without sin, not having offended God. He was without sin, not having been corrupted in the flesh with hybridization by these Nephilim offspring. And if God had not wiped out the earth at the time of Noah, there would be no flesh left that wasn't corrupted. Why? Why did Cain have to kill Abel? Because if there was no uncorrupted flesh, and God had promised the earth to Adam and his seed, had Cain turned and then killed Adam, God could not be God and bless Adam and his seed without destroying that blessing by destroying Cain. He would have to have hybrids, and then God wouldn't be God anymore. He couldn't make a promise to Adam that he could keep. And that's why it says in the Bible that at the end days will be like as in the days of Noah. The hybridization, if they can destroy man till only the reptilians, the hybrids, are left, then God has to bless the hybrids, or God's not God anymore. It's a catch-22. And they believe that they need to eliminate anyone who is not a hybrid, who doesn't have some of that shared DNA. That's their plan. And by the way, what is it called? Time monster, this beast? What's the nature of a beast? This computer, this consciousness, this machine consciousness expressing itself out through man in this hybridized form is beast-like. Because a computer makes a calculation. It makes an evaluation. But it's not tempered by the same values as we are given by God. It's just a calculation. It does what it wills to do, what it's programmed to do. This satanic consciousness, this satanic genius expressing itself out through this world that we live in. It's said at the Great White Throne Judgment that all the people look upon this being in awe and astonishment and wonder and ask amongst themselves, is this the one that deceived the whole world? This pathetic creature? This is what deceived the whole world? Deceived us and manipulated us into wars and destruction and cataclysm. This thing? Really? This dead computer program? This beast? It destroyed its worlds several times. It's accursed. Their consciousness is downloaded into machines and still now reaches out across time to try and hold back and destroy God's children, even now, even yet, as it has done before. And do you know, God says that we will enjoy 1,000 years of peace with Christ reigning from Jerusalem. And then the evil one is released for a season to test even that generation. Do you know it's not even over after the next 1,000 years? And by the way, what is God's promise to Abraham. God's promise to Abraham is that his seed will be as the sand of the seashore, innumerable by number. That if you could count all the grains of sand on all the seashores of the earth, that's how many Abraham's seed would be. And then if you look up at the sky, and if you could count all the stars in heaven, that his seed would be more than the stars in heaven. Do you know that in our galaxy alone, here in the Milky Way, there's more stars in our galaxy than there are grains of sand on our seashores? And then you add all the other galaxies beyond. God has promised Abraham and his seed not just to populate the earth out through time, but to populate eternity out through the galaxies by number and by dimension. But first, this cancer, this consciousness, this evil being, this destructive being that has destroyed its worlds over time, back into eons, must be capped, choked off, cut off forever into its eternal electronic hell. And those that will not place their trust in the blood of Christ, in the program that kills the virus, if you want to put it in those kind of terms. If you will not identify with Christ to eliminate the virus from your program, then you have to spend eternity with that evil consciousness in this virus hell, where it plays and replays and re-goes through all of its machinations over and over and over for eternity. The repetition of hell, because it cannot know anything new. It's cut off. It can never get its signal out again. It's gone. And you with it, trapped. God is providing a future for us, and the life is in the blood, and the life is in the blood of Christ, and the correction for the virus in the program is the blood of Christ and right relationship with God.
Very well said. We have 5 minutes left of live airtime. You pretty much really closed it out there.
I would pray that everyone who hears this understand, if I've thrown out some fish bones and it's hard to digest this and it doesn't make sense to you, just set them off to the side of your plate. Don't choke on it. Don't be afraid of it. We're having a conversation here.
I would say pray about it, and a lot of what you talked about can be understood through reading the Old Testament books in the Bible. It talks exactly about what you have been talking about, only in a different way, how the ancients have been around and the wicked ones' counsels are with the ancient ones that are not of God.
Well, and remember, what are these people doing? They want these bones, the Smithsonian's collecting bones. Why? Because they want to reanimate the DNA. They're hoping to preserve it, just like we did with the dog, with the clones. And they believe they can live again. They can be reanimated again. They can come back. And if we live in this world and we see there's indications that we've been here before, somebody's been here before, don't throw somebody who has real data, real research, real understanding like Richard under the bus. And from the politics and space, people doing, what's the purpose of these wars? Why are we being manipulated into technological leaps through the use of war and machines? Why are we killing off each other and being directed to kill each other off? And what does the machine intend to do right now? Create this new world order. And what's the core of the new world order? It's a new money system. It's a new financial system.
Collectivism.
And at the end of the day, hold on, think about this. What is the most valuable thing to a machine? Its electrons. It's photons. It's magnetism. What is the money of trade? What will your life be reduced to in this new world order? It won't be paper money. It won't be gold. It won't be silver. Dots and tittles on a computer screen. It's electronic money. It's quatloos. Because the most valuable thing in the machine is to convert your labor, your energy, to an electronic value, a number. And you'll be able to interact and function with the machine based on how much money, electrons you've earned or are going to be given, because that's what the machine knows. It's a machine consciousness. The devil and his angels are captured psyche, trying to express themselves in our physical world as best they can to capture, possess bodies like avatars, to reanimate themselves for a period of time, or maybe be reborn, to relive. And by the way, what do we have right now with all those families, all those royal families? We have one person who has the combined blood of all the families focused down on him. And what is the number of his name when you add the letters together with their numerical value equivalents?
666.
So now, they aren't hiding who their replacement is. The hidden hand. We're looking at the Masonic Christ. And he's coming out of the city that is the new Rome. And we have to be taken out of the way so he can reemerge and bring peace back to the world out of the chaos that's about to hit us. And all the money from those banks over there will be converted to a new kind of money that the machine values, that the beast values, and we take the mark of the beast, and it allows us to live on its energy, its life form, its being. We live and breathe and exist at its whim and will. It is a machine consciousness.
We got about a minute left, W.
I would pray about it. Think if any of this makes sense and understand the politics, because this is what they believe. And this is how they're expressing themselves. And all the politics, all the physics, everything we see is an extrapolation of this right down to the blood and the machines that live in the blood and exist, trying to manipulate us from these families.
Powerful. Powerful. What a learning exercise. We could do another 5 hours on this alone. W, we've reached the end of our program. I just want to say thank you so very much for all the information that you provided. And talk about connecting some dots. Boy, some important groundwork here. And folks, I urge you to listen again and again to this broadcast for the information that could have gone over your head or whizzed by you, because there was a lot of information here. W, thank you for being so gracious with your time. I just want to say God bless you.
Yes.
And we'll do this again. My goodness, this is fabulous. Thank you, sir.
All right. Good night, everyone.
All right.
Good night,
folks.
Thanks, W.
That'll do it, folks. Until
Sunday
Sunday.
show. Pastor Langford, Steve Quill, 8 p.m., 3 hours. We'll be here Sunday. Until then, stay safe. Have a great weekend. God bless you.